The midday sun cast long shadows over the bustling city square, where the flow of people moved like a restless tide. Conversations blended into a dull hum, the occasional honking of a distant car breaking the monotony. Amid the crowd, an elderly man, hunched with age, struggled with his heavy grocery bags. His frail hands trembled as he adjusted his grip, trying not to let the weight overwhelm him. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson walked unnoticed through the crowd, his face partially concealed by a cap and dark sunglasses. He relished rare moments like this, being just another person, free from the constant attention. But as he passed near the central fountain, a different kind of attention caught his eye. A group of teenagers stood in a loose circle around the chute. Elderly man, their smirks and laughter carrying an undertone of cruelty. At first it seemed subtle. A slight shove here, a mocking gesture there. The old man kept his head down, as if pretending it wasn't happening would make it stop. A careless nudge sent one of his bags tumbling, oranges spilling onto the pavement. A boy kicked one away, laughing as it rolled under a nearby bench. People walked past, some glancing but quickly looking away. The Rock stopped. A slow, familiar anger built in his chest, not just at the kids, but at everyone around them. He had seen it before. It wasn't just the cruelty that was the problem. It was the silence, the acceptance, the unspoken rule that if something didn't concern you, you should just keep walking. He wasn't about to keep walking. He took a few steps closer, not saying a word, simply watching. His presence alone was enough to shift the air around them. One of the boys, tall, wiry, with an air of arrogance, noticed him first. His laughter faltered for a second before he recovered, nudging his friend and whispering something. The others barely acknowledged the Rock, too engrossed in their game of humiliation. The elderly man bent down, reaching for an orange that had rolled near his feet. Before he could grab it, a sneaker stepped on it, crushing the fruit into a sticky mess on the pavement. More laughter followed. The Rock's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists inside his pockets. It wasn't about a piece of fruit. It was about dignity, something these kids had stripped from the man without a second thought. Around them, the city moved on, blind to the quiet cruelty unfolding in its heart. A woman pushing a stroller glanced over, then quickly turned away. A man in a suit slowed his pace, but then continued, shaking his head as if it were just another unfortunate scene in the backdrop of daily life. Indifference was as much an act as the bullying itself. One of the teenagers, a boy younger than the rest, noticed the Rock's gaze and shifted uncomfortably. The laughter wasn't as free-flowing anymore. There was an unspoken challenge in the air now. The Rock didn't move, didn't speak. He wanted them to feel it, to realize, perhaps for the first time, that someone was watching who wouldn't just walk away. The elderly man sighed, the weight of years evident in the way he moved. He crouched again to retrieve another fallen item, his fingers slow and unsteady. Another kick sent a loaf of bread skidding across the pavement. The lead boy grinned, crossing his arms as if daring someone, anyone, to stop him. The Rock took another step forward. The leader of the group met his eyes for the first time. There was no mistaking that look, intimidation creeping in, masked by forced indifference. The other kids noticed too. Their laughter was hesitant now, their movements less bold. The Rock wasn't doing anything, yet he was doing everything. One of the boys muttered something under his breath. Another, the youngest, turned slightly away, no longer eager to participate. A shift was happening, slow but unmistakable. The ringleader, however, wasn't ready to back down. He smirked, picking up an orange from the ground and tossing it lazily in the air. "Relax, old man," he said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "We're just having fun." The elderly man didn't respond. He just kept gathering. His groceries, his shoulders slightly more hunched than before. His silence was resignation, a lifetime of knowing that the world rarely steps in to help. But today it would. The Rock took one last step, placing himself directly between the teenagers and the old man. The shift in power was immediate. The leader's smirk twitched, uncertain now. The Rock didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to throw a punch. His presence alone was enough to send a clear message. This stops now. The laughter died completely. A few of the boys exchanged nervous glances. The youngest took another step back, subtly distancing himself from the group. The city noise continued, but within their small circle, a new kind of silence settled. A heavier one? The lead boy hesitated, but then forced a chuckle, tossing the orange aside. "Whatever," he muttered. "It's not a big deal." He glanced around, realizing that people were finally watching. Not just sneaking glances and moving on, but really watching. The spell of indifference had been broken. The elderly man slowly rose to his feet, his eyes meeting the Rock's for the first time. There was no need for words between them. Gratitude was there, unspoken, yet understood. And for the first time in that long, painful moment, the old man no longer felt invisible. One by one, the teenagers started to step away, no longer amused, no longer feeling untouchable. The leader was the last to linger, shifting his weight, as if debating whether to say something. In the end, he simply scoffed, shaking his head. "Come on," he grumbled to his friends. "Let's go." They left without a word, their energy drained, their confidence cracked. The Rock didn't move until they were out of sight. He exhaled slowly, then turned to the elderly man, who was now gripping his bags tightly, as if expecting them to be taken from him again. Instead, the Rock knelt down and picked up the last remaining items, placing them carefully into one of the bags. The old man watched him, a flicker of surprise crossing his worn features. He had spent years carrying burdens alone. Today, for the first time in a long time, someone had lifted even a small part of that weight, as the Rock handed him the bag. The old man hesitated before nodding, a simple gesture, but filled with meaning. He turned and walked away, blending into the city once more. The Rock watched until he disappeared into the crowd, then adjusted his cap and continued on his way. It wasn't a grand act, it wasn't a heroic battle, but sometimes stopping, simply, refusing to ignore, was enough to change everything. As the Rock resumed his walk through the crowded square, he couldn't shake the lingering weight of what had just transpired. It wasn't the first time he had witnessed cruelty masked as amusement, nor would it be the last. But something about the old man's silence, the way he had simply endured, felt heavier than usual. His mind drifted as he weaved through the sea of strangers, their faces blurring into a single, indifferent mass. He wondered how many times that old man had suffered similar moments, unseen and unchallenged. He wondered how many other people in the crowd had noticed, but chose to move on, convincing themselves that it wasn't their place to interfere. There was a time in his life when he might have done the same. Before the fame, before the power that came with his presence, he had been just another kid trying to survive. He had seen people turn away before, leaving others to fend for themselves. He had learned early on that the world often rewarded silence, more than action, but that was a lesson he had long since unlearned. Strength wasn't just about muscles. It was about choosing to stand when it would be easier to walk away. The Rock stopped near a coffee stand, ordering a bottle of water, while his thoughts lingered on the faces of the teenagers. They weren't monsters. They were just kids, caught up in the easy cruelty that came with power unchecked. He wondered if they would remember today, if they would change, even a little. If, years from now, one of them might find themselves in the old man's place, finally understanding what they had once done. His gaze drifted to the edge of the square, where an old woman sat on a weathered bench, staring at nothing in particular. Her expression was distant, lost in the haze of memories long past. She had the same look of quiet resignation as the old man, a person who had been ignored for so long that she no longer expected anything else. How many like her sat unnoticed in the world? How many walked through life like ghosts, seen but never truly acknowledged? The barista handed him his water, and he murmured a quiet thanks before taking a sip. The weight in his chest remained. As he turned to leave, he noticed a group of young professionals at a nearby table, laughing over coffee, completely immersed in their own world. Their conversations were light, filled with complaints about long work hours and difficult clients. One of them, a man in a sharp suit, gestured toward the elderly woman on the bench and chuckled. "She's been sitting there for hours," he said. "Probably doesn't even know what year it is." The others laughed, shaking their heads. One muttered something about how sad it was. Another suggested she might be waiting for someone who would never come. Their amusement wasn't cruel like the teenagers had been, but it was something worse, apathetic, distant. They spoke about her as if she were a character in a story rather than a living, breathing person a few feet away. The Rock clenched, his jaw. It wasn't just kids who needed to be reminded of what respect looked like. He walked toward the bench, feeling the weight of the professionals' amused gazes on his back. The old woman barely noticed him at first, her thin fingers tracing invisible patterns on the fabric of her skirt. When he stopped in front of her, she blinked up at him, as if startled by the sudden acknowledgement. Without a word, he sat down beside her, offering a nod. The act was simple, almost meaningless in the grand scheme of things, but to her it meant everything. Her eyes searched his face, curiosity flickering in them. When was the last time someone had chosen to sit beside her, not out of obligation, but simply because they wanted to? The group of professionals had stopped laughing. They were watching now, uncertain, their easy amusement replaced by something else, perhaps discomfort, perhaps shame. Minutes passed in silence, the city moving around them like a tide that refused to acknowledge what had just shifted. The woman exhaled slowly, a soft but contented sigh, as if relieved that for the first time in a long while she wasn't just a forgotten piece of the scenery. Eventually, she turned to him and smiled, a small, fragile thing, but genuine. "You have a kind heart," she said softly. The Rock simply nodded. He didn't do it for praise. He did it because some things shouldn't be ignored. When he finally stood and walked away, he didn't bother looking back at the group of professionals. He didn't need to. The silence that hung over their table was proof enough that they had heard the message loud and clear. As the Rock walked away from the square, his mind drifted to a memory buried deep in his past. He was 10 years old, sitting on the front steps of a run-down apartment complex, watching his mother wipe tears from her face. They had just been evicted. Their few belongings were packed into plastic bags beside them, the weight of uncertainty, pressing down harder than any physical burden. People walked past them without a second glance. Neighbors who had once borrowed sugar, shopkeepers who had smiled at them just days before. Now they hurried along as if not seeing them would erase the discomfort. Indifference had been louder than words that day. But then a man had stopped. Just a stranger. He didn't offer money or empty platitudes. He simply handed his mother a bottle of water and asked if she needed help finding a place to stay. That single moment had stayed with him for years. Not because it had solved everything, but because it had reminded them that they weren't invisible. Now, decades later, the Rock understood the power in something as simple as stopping to acknowledge someone's struggle. He reached a quiet street, lined with small shops, the city square fading into the background. The weight in his chest remained, not as anger, but as an awareness that refused to be ignored. The world hadn't changed much since that day on the apartment steps. People still walked past hardship without looking. They still told themselves that it wasn't their responsibility, that someone else would step in. He had seen it in the teenagers mocking the old man. He had seen it in the professionals at the coffee shop. He had seen it in himself before he chose to act. A gust of wind kicked up fallen leaves along the sidewalk. He paused in front of a small bakery, the scent of fresh bread filling the air. A young woman behind the counter smiled at him, unaware of the storm of thoughts running through his mind. He nodded back, but his focus was elsewhere. The memory of his mother's tears still clung to him, refusing to be forgotten. Further down the street, he spotted a man struggling with a flat tire, kneeling on the pavement as cars whizzed by. His hands were shaking, frustration clear on his face. No one slowed down. No one offered help. The Rock stopped a few feet away, watching for a moment. He wasn't the only one who noticed. The pedestrians walking past had all seen the man. Some glanced briefly before continuing on. Others deliberately looked away. The same pattern, repeating itself. But before he could step forward, someone else did. A young guy, probably in his early 20s, approached the struggling man with a hesitant smile. He gestured toward the tire, offering help. The Rock exhaled. Slowly, a small sense of relief settling in his chest. It wasn't just about him stepping up. It was about the world remembering that it still could. The young man knelt beside the driver, loosening the bolts with careful movements. The driver looked surprised at first, then nodded in quiet gratitude. It was such a simple moment, hardly remarkable. Yet it carried the same weight as the Rock's own actions earlier that day. The ripple had spread. Another passerby stopped, an older woman clutching a grocery bag. She didn't kneel down, but she stood there watching, not in the detached way people had done before, but in acknowledgement. A minute later, a second man stepped forward, asking if they needed a hand. The Rock smiled to himself. This was how change happened, not through grand speeches or viral moments, but in the quiet decisions of everyday people, one act leading to another, until the pattern of indifference was broken. The tire was changed within minutes. The driver shook hands with the young man, who had first stepped in, nodding in thanks. The others slowly returned to their day, but the moment lingered in the air. People who had once been on autopilot were now aware. The Rock didn't stay to say anything. He didn't need to. Instead, he walked on, letting the moment settle into his bones. Somewhere behind him, an old woman was no longer invisible. An elderly man had been reminded that he wasn't alone. A driver had been helped by a stranger, and in the city, For today, indifference had lost. The Rock continued walking, the city shifting around him like an ever-moving tide. But the echoes of the past still clung to him, whispering through his memories. He thought of his father, a man of immense strength, yet burdened by his own battles. His father had been a fighter, both in and out of the ring. But there was one thing even his fists couldn't beat: the creeping passage of time. As the Rock grew stronger, his father grew older, his once powerful hands becoming slower, his voice losing the unshakable authority it once carried. He had watched, helpless, as the world began to look through his father instead of at him. It had been a slow, painful shift, one he hadn't fully understood as a young man. Only now, seeing the elderly man in the square and the old woman on the bench, did the full weight of it settle on him. Aging wasn't just a battle against time. It was a battle against being forgotten, and not everyone was strong enough to fight it alone. The thought lingered as he passed by a reflective glass window, catching his own image in its surface. He saw himself as the world did, a tower of strength, a force that commanded attention. But what about years from now? Would there come a day when people walked past him without recognition? When he reached for something and found the world no longer willing to extend a hand back? Would there be a moment when his voice, once powerful, would be spoken over, dismissed? He exhaled, pushing the thought away. The future wasn't written yet, but today was. And today, he had made sure someone had been seen. A few blocks ahead, he noticed the elderly man from the square again. He was moving slower now, his bag still heavy, though his posture was no longer as defeated. He hadn't seen the Rock yet, and for a moment The Rock considered walking past, letting the moment be what it was, complete in itself, but then the man stopped. Not because he was tired, but because he had spotted another elderly person sitting alone on the steps of a closed storefront. This second man was thinner, his clothes more worn, his eyes carrying a distant sadness. Without hesitation, the old man set his bags down and pulled out a loaf of bread. He tore it in half and handed a piece to the other man, who blinked in surprise. Before hesitantly accepting, the Rock watched, unmoving, one act leading to another. The cycle continued. The weight in the Rock's chest eased, not completely, but enough. He took a deep breath, feeling the city's pulse around him, but now it didn't seem quite as indifferent as before. Maybe it wasn't about changing the entire world in one day. Maybe it wasn't about single-handedly stopping every injustice. Maybe it was just about breaking the pattern, one moment at a time. The elderly man didn't look around to see if anyone had witnessed his gesture. He simply nodded to his companion, picked up his bags, and continued walking. And for the first time that day, the Rock let himself smile. As he turned a corner, heading back toward where his day had begun, he saw something unexpected. The group of teenagers from earlier, they weren't tormenting anyone now. Instead, they were standing near the coffee shop, shifting uncomfortably as they watched the elderly woman on the bench. The same one they had laughed about earlier. One of the boys took a breath, stepped forward, and spoke to her. The Rock was too far to hear, but he didn't need to. He saw it in her face, the flicker of surprise, then warmth. The teenager said something else, then hesitated, before offering his hand to help her up. She took it. The cycle had truly broken. Hours later, as the city's rhythm slowed with the fading sun, the Rock found himself on a quieter street. He sat on a bench, taking a rare moment to breathe, letting the day settle into his bones. A man passing by did a double take, recognizing him. But instead of rushing for a photo or an autograph, he simply nodded with quiet respect. The Rock nodded back. Fame wasn't forever. Strength would fade. The world would change, as it always did. But if he could leave something behind, even if it was just the idea that people should still see each other, then maybe that was enough. The wind carried the sounds of the city around him, laughter, voices, footsteps on pavement, life moving forward. He thought of his father again, of his mother, of the stranger who had once stopped to help them when they had nothing. How many? Lives had changed that day simply because one person decided to care. He would never know, but that didn't mean it hadn't mattered. The next morning, when he stepped out of his hotel, he spotted a small bakery across the street. An elderly man sat at one of the outdoor tables, sipping coffee alone, his gaze distant. Without thinking, the Rock crossed the street, ordered 2 coffees, and set one down in front of the man before taking a seat across from him. The man blinked in confusion. "I didn't. Just enjoy it," the Rock said with a small smile. The man hesitated, then slowly he smiled back, one act leading to another. The Rock left before the moment could be turned into anything bigger than it was. This wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about dramatic gestures. It was about something smaller but stronger. It was about making sure that in a world that moved too fast, someone always stopped to see. As he walked away, he saw the ripple again, a waitress at the bakery, smiling as she refilled the old man's coffee, a stranger holding the door open for another, a moment of kindness that hadn't been there before. The world wouldn't change overnight, but today it had changed enough, and for the Rock, that was more than enough. Indifference is a choice. So is action. Today someone stood up. Tomorrow, it could be you. Will you be the one to break the cycle? If this story moved you, subscribe and share it, because kindness spreads one moment at a time.